This is Space Invaders for the Atari 7800 Pro System, a 2008 homebrew release by Bob DiCrescenzo, the same genius who put together the wonderful Pac-Man collection for the same console. A recreation of the 1978 title space shooter where you attempt to clear waves of descending space invaders before they land and take over whatever it is you're trying to defend. Space Invaders on the 7800 is probably the most authentic looking version of Space Invaders on the old Atari consoles. The original arcade invaders have been redrawn and recreated almost perfectly, as has the overall layout and typeface used. It almost feels like an emulated version of the arcade Space Invaders, which is really saying something considering this is quarter-century-old hardware on display, albeit playing software only concocted a few years ago. But regardless, this is a mightily impressive looking version of Space Invaders that not only looks the part but also plays the part quite nicely. Control is pretty solid for the most part, it would have to be at this point. Reaction time is almost instantaneous, and gameplay is about as close to the original as one would expect. Challenge level is about on par as well, so you'll be able to play just as poorly here as you would in the original, or just as well. Doesn't discriminate. As I said before, the sprite work is pretty spot on, as is the typeface used, so that there's that meticulous attention to detail that makes this a visually impressive port. Sound effects are good enough for what they are, not quite arcade perfect, but they did nail the background beat or whatever you call it. On a whole, Space Invaders got a nice little treatment on the 7800, and on this merit alone, it's a worthwhile replacement for that Atari 2600 port you've been stuck with for years. But a near perfect recreation of the arcade original Space Invaders is not the only highlight to this homebrew. Much like DiCrescenzo's Pac-Man collection, Space Invaders offers a number of gameplay options to mess around with the overall experience. Inspired by the technically inferior but still entertaining Atari 2600 version, Space Invaders on the 7800 includes options such as toggling the speed of the invader shots, the angle of the invader shots, moving shields, and yes, invisible invaders. So the replayability of this version is increased exponentially as a result, because you can fiddle around with any combination of options to make each game varied from the last, and you can make the game as easy or as ball-bustingly difficult as your heart desires. Of course, if you prefer your Space Invaders pure and unaltered, you can always do that too, and you have 4 or 5 different color options to fiddle around with. Overall, if you're a fan of the old school Space Invaders arcade game and you happen to own an Atari 7800, then Space Invaders is a no-brainer. With its near perfect replication of the arcade game and its plentiful customization options, it is perhaps the definitive home port of Space Invaders available. Super Nintendo fanboy, sit the fuck down. Your version had jack shit. This Atari 7800 version had 4 color schemes, 2 players simultaneous competition, moving shields, angled bomb shots, and invisible invaders. All your version had was cellophane simulation. It's so goddamn bare bones they fit the whole thing onto a Game Boy cartridge, for fuck's sake. Go back to bed. So, where was I? Oh yeah. Space Invaders for the Atari 7800 is perhaps the finest version of the game on the old consoles that you can get, and is definitely deserving of a spot in your Atari 7800 collection.